Welcome to Dark Forces by Scoob. I'm your host, Niall Cross, and today we're diving deep into one of the most bizarre and damaging mass hysteria events in modern American history. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s and early 1990s wasn't just a passing fad or innocent superstition. It destroyed lives, tore families apart, and created a climate of fear that still echoes today. But here's the shocking truth. It was built almost entirely on lies, manipulation, and mass delusion. How did an entire nation become convinced that devil-worshipping cults were lurking in every daycare center, hiding messages in rock music, and conducting ritual sacrifices in suburban neighborhoods? The answer is more disturbing than the myths themselves, because it reveals just how easily fear can override reason, and how those in power can exploit our deepest anxieties for their own gain. Our story begins in 1980 with a single book that would change everything. Michelle Remembers. This wasn't just another memoir. It was the match that lit a wildfire of paranoia across America. Michelle Smith, a Canadian woman suffering from mild depression after a miscarriage, sought help from psychiatrist Lawrence Pasder. What started as routine therapy sessions soon spiraled into something far more sinister. Under Pasder's guidance, Smith began recovering supposedly repressed memories of horrific ritual abuse she claimed to have endured as a 5-year-old child. But these weren't ordinary abuse allegations. They were fantastical tales that defied belief. Smith claimed she had been tortured in cemeteries, held in cages filled with snakes, assaulted with candles, and forced to witness infant mutilations. The stories grew increasingly bizarre. She alleged that devil's horns and a tail had been surgically attached to her body, and that she had personally confronted Satan himself during elaborate rituals. Here's what makes this story particularly disturbing. Despite these allegedly traumatic experiences, there was absolutely no evidence they had ever occurred. No physical scars, no disruption to her schooling, and remarkably, her own family members, including her sisters, had no memory of these supposed events. You'd think this complete lack of corroboration would have raised red flags, but instead, Michelle Remembers became a bestseller. The book's success launched Smith and Pasder into fame as leading experts on ritual abuse. They traveled the lecture circuit, appeared on television shows, and eventually married each other, a detail that raises serious questions about the therapeutic relationship and professional boundaries. But the real damage was just beginning. Michelle Remembers didn't just tell a story. It created a template. Suddenly, similar allegations began surfacing across the country, following eerily similar patterns. The recovered memory movement gained momentum, with therapists using techniques like hypnosis to help clients uncover supposedly buried trauma. About 15% of these cases explicitly involved claims of satanic ritual abuse, and they all followed the same disturbing formula. Picture this scenario, repeated thousands of times across America. A woman in her 20s or 30s enters therapy for common issues like depression or low self-esteem. The therapist, armed with techniques like hypnosis and guided by books like Michelle Remembers, begins probing for hidden memories. At first, the recovered memories might seem relatively mundane, but therapists would push their clients to dig deeper, insisting that more traumatic experiences must be buried beneath the surface. What emerged from these sessions was a horror show of alleged memories. Satanic ritual activities, infant sacrifices, and unimaginable tortures. Many clients developed what was diagnosed as multiple personality disorder, their minds seemingly fractured by the supposed trauma they were uncovering. The more therapy they received, the worse their condition became. Yet both therapists and clients remained convinced they were uncovering historical truth. But here's the critical question. Were these memories real? The answer requires us to consider an uncomfortable reality. For these recovered memories to be entirely true, we would have to believe in a vast, coordinated network of satanic cults operating across the entire United States, systematically murdering infants and conducting elaborate rituals, all while leaving no trace of evidence and somehow remaining completely invisible to law enforcement and society at large. The logistics alone make this scenario virtually impossible. The more likely explanation is far more disturbing because it implicates the very people who were supposed to be helping these vulnerable individuals. Many of the therapists promoting recovered memory techniques had their own agendas. Evangelical Christians, inspired by Michelle Remembers, saw an opportunity to expose what they believed was a literal war between good and evil. Feminist therapists viewed these stories as evidence of the widespread abuse of women and children in patriarchal society. Specialists in multiple personality disorder found validation for their controversial diagnoses. These therapists weren't necessarily acting maliciously, but they were operating with confirmation bias that led them to guide their clients toward specific narratives. They used leading questions, assigned homework involving books about ritual abuse, and created an environment where clients felt pressure to produce increasingly dramatic memories. Some clients needed little encouragement. By the late 1980s, stories of satanic abuse were everywhere in popular media, creating a cultural template that vulnerable individuals could unconsciously adopt. While therapists were extracting false memories from vulnerable adults, another front in the satanic panic was opening up around popular music. The idea that rock bands were embedding subliminal satanic messages in their songs captured the public imagination and added fuel to the growing hysteria. The concept wasn't entirely new. Musicians had occasionally included backward messages in their recordings, usually as jokes or artistic experiments. Electric Light Orchestra famously embedded a backward message in their song, Fire on High, that humorously declared, "The music is reversible, but time is not. Turn back, turn back, turn back, turn back." But what started as musical experimentation was twisted into evidence of a vast satanic conspiracy. In 1982, a Minnesota DJ named Chris Edmonds gained considerable attention by playing segments of popular songs in reverse on his radio show, claiming to reveal hidden satanic phrases. The most famous example was Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. When played backward, some claimed to hear the phrase "Sweet Satan" and an entire soliloquy. "So here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He will give those with him 666. There was a little tool shed where he made us suffer. Sad Satan." Here's the fascinating psychology behind this phenomenon. If you play Stairway to Heaven backward, without any suggestion about what you're supposed to hear, most people will just perceive meaningless gibberish. But once someone tells you what words to listen for, especially if you read the alleged transcript while listening, your brain begins to impose that pattern on the random sounds. It's a perfect example of how suggestion can create the perception of reality where none exists. This wasn't the first time people had searched for hidden messages in popular music. In the early 1970s, Beatles fans had convinced themselves they could hear clues about Paul McCartney's supposed death when playing certain songs backward. But the satanic message hysteria was different. It tapped into deeper fears about moral corruption and evil influences targeting young people. The musicians themselves consistently denied embedding satanic messages, but their denials were largely ignored. Some panic promoters even suggested that evil entities could insert these messages without the musicians' knowledge or consent, a claim that conveniently couldn't be disproven. No discussion of music and the Satanic Panic would be complete without examining Ozzy Osbourne, who became the poster child for supposedly dangerous rock music. Osbourne cultivated an image as the Prince of Darkness through both his music and his outrageous public behavior. But the line between performance and reality became dangerously blurred in the public mind. Ozzy's reputation was built on a series of shocking incidents that became legendary in rock history. In a meeting with CBS Records executives, he bit the head off a live dove and spat it onto the conference table. During a concert performance, he bit the head off a bat, requiring a rabies shot when the bat bit his tongue in return. These acts were designed to shock and generate publicity, and they succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. But the real controversy came with his song, Suicide Solution. In 1985, when teenager John McCollum died by suicide, his parents filed a lawsuit against Osbourne, claiming that lyrics like, "Where to hide? Suicide is the only way out. Don't you know what it's really about?" had influenced their son's death. A similar lawsuit emerged in 1991 with another family making the same claim. Both cases were ultimately dismissed by the courts, but they reinforced the narrative that rock music posed a genuine threat to young people. Osbourne further cemented his dark image with songs like Mr. Crowley, which referenced the infamous early 20th century occultist Aleister Crowley. Crowley, who wrote extensively about satanic rituals and claimed to practice human and animal sacrifice, remained a controversial figure who fascinated some musicians. By invoking Crowley's name, Osbourne was deliberately courting controversy and feeding into the fears that were already circulating. The irony is that much of Osbourne's later career would reveal him to be far more ordinary than his stage persona suggested. The MTV reality show, The Osbournes, which aired from 2002 to 2005, showed him as a bumbling, substance-impaired family man, struggling with the mundane challenges of domestic life. The show became MTV's most-watched program, largely because audiences were fascinated by the contrast between his fearsome public image and his actual personality. While musicians were being accused of corrupting America's youth through subliminal messages, a far more serious panic was unfolding in the realm of childcare. The McMartin preschool scandal of 1984 became the most infamous example of how satanic panic could destroy lives and communities. The case began in suburban Los Angeles, when investigators claimed to have uncovered evidence that teachers at the McMartin preschool had been systematically abusing students for over a decade. But these weren't ordinary abuse allegations. They included grotesque claims of graveyard rituals, animal torture, and disturbing sexual acts conducted in candlelit churches. One of the most sensational allegations involved a witness who claimed that disguised adults had forced her 2-year-old son to insert his fingers into a goat's anus and drink the blood of an infant. The McMartin case set off a cascade of similar allegations at daycare centers across the United States. The pattern was always similar. Children, often under intense questioning from investigators and prosecutors, would eventually produce stories that mirrored the fantastical elements first described in Michelle Remembers. The more outrageous the allegations, the more media attention they received, creating a feedback loop that encouraged even more extreme claims. What makes these cases particularly tragic is how the investigative process itself traumatized the children involved. Prosecutors and child protection workers, convinced they were uncovering a massive conspiracy, used leading questions and psychological pressure to extract the testimonies they believed would expose the truth. Children who initially denied any abuse were questioned repeatedly until they began producing the stories adults wanted to hear. The phenomenon wasn't limited to daycare centers. As the panic evolved, accusations began targeting family members, particularly parents. These cases typically emerged from therapy sessions where adults claimed to have recovered memories of childhood abuse. The pattern was predictable. Initial therapeutic revelations, confrontation with accused parents, denials and family turmoil, followed by prolonged legal battles that destroyed families and communities. To understand how the Satanic Panic sustained itself for over a decade, we need to examine who benefited from perpetuating these fears. The answer reveals a disturbing truth about how moral panics can become self-sustaining industries that serve the interests of those who profit from public hysteria. Talk show hosts discovered that satanic abuse stories generated tremendous ratings. Television producers found that audiences couldn't get enough of these sensational tales, leading to countless documentaries, news reports, and made-for-TV movies about the supposed satanic threat. Religious broadcasters use these stories to fundraise and build their audiences by positioning themselves as warriors in a cosmic battle between good and evil. Book publishers made fortunes selling memoirs of alleged ritual abuse survivors, therapy guides for recovering suppressed memories, and exposés of supposed satanic conspiracies. Anti-cult organizations expanded their influence by positioning themselves as experts on the satanic threat, receiving funding from government agencies and private donors to combat this perceived menace. Perhaps most troubling was how this panic infiltrated legitimate institutions. Police departments across the country held taxpayer-funded workshops to train officers in recognizing signs of satanic activity. Child protection workers attended seminars on identifying ritual abuse. Mental health professionals embraced controversial therapeutic techniques that were supposedly necessary to help survivors recover their buried memories. This created a feedback loop where the very institutions responsible for protecting public safety and welfare became vectors for spreading unfounded fears. When police officers and social workers began looking for signs of satanic abuse, they inevitably found what they were looking for, not because it was there, but because they had been trained to interpret ambiguous evidence through the lens of their preconceptions. The most insidious aspect of this industry was how it exploited genuine social problems for its own purposes. Child abuse is a real and serious issue, but by focusing attention on fantastical satanic conspiracies, resources and attention were diverted from addressing the actual causes and patterns of abuse. Women who sought therapy for legitimate psychological issues found themselves caught up in elaborate false memory scenarios that often made their conditions worse rather than better. The Satanic Panic wasn't confined to the United States. It spread internationally, demonstrating how moral panics can cross cultural boundaries when they tap into universal fears and anxieties. By the early 1990s, similar allegations were surfacing in England, with reports of ritualistic child abuse supposedly linked to satanic sex. The British cases followed the same pattern as their American counterparts. Children making increasingly elaborate claims under intensive questioning. Adults recovering memories of childhood ritual abuse. And communities torn apart by accusations that had no basis in reality. The panic even reached into established religious communities, with some allegations targeting mainstream organizations like the Mormon Church. However, the international spread of the panic also led to its eventual debunking. In 1994, the British Ministry of Health released a comprehensive study that found no independent corroboration for reports of satanic child abuse in the UK. Professor Jean Lafontaine from the London School of Economics conducted a thorough investigation and concluded that the supposed disclosures from children had been heavily influenced by adults, particularly mothers who had become convinced of the reality of satanic abuse. LaFontaine's research revealed the crucial role that evangelical Christians had played in promoting these narratives as part of their broader campaign against new religious movements. The ideological motivations behind the panic were becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't about protecting children or uncovering hidden conspiracies, but about advancing particular religious and social agendas. To understand how an entire society could become convinced of something so demonstrably false, we need to examine the psychological and social factors that make mass hysteria possible. Sociologist Kai Erikson observed that outbreaks of witchcraft hysteria often occur in societies experiencing significant religious or social disruption. These panics serve as a way for communities to process anxiety about change by projecting their fears onto external enemies. Anthropologist Marvin Harris noted a similar pattern in historical witch hunts, where the poor and disenfranchised were encouraged to blame their problems on witches and devils, rather than examining the actions of those in power. When crops failed or roofs leaked, it was easier to attribute these misfortunes to supernatural malevolence, rather than addressing systemic issues of inequality and exploitation. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s followed this same pattern. America was experiencing rapid social change. Traditional family structures were evolving, women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and religious authority was being questioned. Rather than grappling with the complexity of these changes, it was psychologically easier to believe that the problems were caused by a hidden enemy engaged in the ultimate evil. The figure of Satan provided the perfect scapegoat because he represented absolute malevolence against which any opposition could be justified. If devil worshippers were really torturing children and corrupting youth through rock music, then extreme measures to combat them were not just justified, but morally necessary. This allowed people to feel heroic and righteous while avoiding the more difficult work of addressing real social problems. The recovered memory phenomenon exploited similar psychological vulnerabilities. For individuals struggling with depression, anxiety, or relationship problems, the idea that these difficulties stemmed from suppressed trauma provided both an explanation and a sense of absolution. If their problems were caused by ritual abuse they couldn't remember, then they weren't responsible for their current struggles. They were survivors of unimaginable evil. By the mid-1990s, the Satanic Panic was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions and the growing skepticism of researchers and legal professionals. The lack of physical evidence for the elaborate conspiracies that had supposedly operated for decades became increasingly difficult to ignore. Despite thousands of allegations and extensive investigations, law enforcement had found no proof of organized satanic networks, no evidence of the massive number of murdered infants that should have resulted from these supposed rituals, and no credible witnesses who weren't connected to the recovered memory movement. The therapeutic techniques that had generated so many abuse allegations came under scientific scrutiny. Researchers demonstrated how suggestive questioning, hypnosis, and other methods used by recovered memory therapists could implant false memories that felt completely real to those who experienced them. The multiple personality disorder diagnoses that had been central to many cases were revealed to be largely iatrogenic, created by the therapeutic process itself, rather than resulting from actual trauma. Legal challenges began mounting against both the criminal prosecutions and the therapeutic practices that had fueled the panic. Families destroyed by false accusations fought back through the courts, and some of the most prominent cases began to unravel. The McMartin preschool case, after years of trials and millions of dollars in legal costs, resulted in no convictions, and many other daycare cases met similar fates. Perhaps most significantly, Some of the key figures who had promoted the panic were exposed as frauds. Mike Warnke, who had built a career as an expert on satanic activities based on his claims of being a former high priest in a Luciferian cult, was thoroughly debunked by Christian investigators in 1992. John Trott and Mike Hertenstein, writing for the magazine Cornerstone, revealed that Warnke's dramatic testimony was largely fabricated, undermining one of the foundational narratives of the entire movement. The collapse of the Satanic Panic left devastation in its wake. Innocent daycare workers had spent years in prison for crimes that never occurred. Families had been destroyed by false accusations that tore apart relationships and communities. Children who had been subjected to intensive questioning and suggestive therapy techniques suffered genuine psychological trauma from the investigative process itself. Adults who had recovered false memories found themselves with years of their lives consumed by pursuing legal actions against family members who had never harmed them. The financial costs were staggering. Millions of dollars in law enforcement investigations, court proceedings, and therapeutic interventions, all directed toward a threat that existed primarily in the imagination. But the social costs were even higher, as trust between community members, family relationships, and faith in institutions were all damaged by the hysteria. Perhaps most tragically, the focus on fantastical satanic conspiracies diverted attention and resources away from addressing real child abuse. While investigators chased shadows and prosecutors pursued cases based on impossible allegations, actual victims of abuse may have gone unprotected because the system was overwhelmed by false claims. The Satanic Panic also revealed disturbing truths about the power of suggestion and the vulnerability of human memory. The recovered memory techniques that generated so many abuse allegations demonstrated how therapeutic authority could be misused to implant false beliefs that felt completely real to those who experienced them. This had implications far beyond the satanic abuse cases, raising questions about the reliability of memory and the ethics of certain therapeutic approaches. As we look back, the Satanic Panic might seem like a strange relic of the past, but its lessons are still urgent today. Fear, suggestion, and groupthink can turn communities against themselves, and moral panic often hides in plain sight. The real danger isn't in imaginary conspiracies. It's in our own willingness to believe the unbelievable. Curious how a mix of paranoia, politics, and panic convinced otherwise rational people that monsters were real. The full story is even darker and more shocking than most imagine. Download the Scoob app now to unlock the complete tale and uncover the secrets behind America's greatest moral panic.